mute if they're not speaking. Perfect. Now it should be fine. Does it work, Matteo? Does it work on your side now as well?
Still hearing the echo.
Oh, I don't hear an echo anymore. So maybe it's also some audio settings. Um, but I hear myself as an echo when you turn on your speaker, so maybe there's something there. But I will briefly, to start saying that I'm very much looking forward to this session on Beyond Silos, Systems Thinking for a More Equitable and Sustainable World, which will be led by our friends and partners from the Millennium Institute, particularly Matteo Pederinci, Chief Scientist, and Fernando Redivo, communications lead at Millennium Institute. And we now have a few years of working history with the Millennium Institute. I mentioned in the previous session that at some point we decided to move from the global transformation work of Earth4All, which we continue, but zoom in a little bit more into different countries. And so from the very beginning, we worked together with the Millennium Institute on the scientific and modeling approaches to fine tune and to kind of project the Earth4All work scenarios, turnarounds onto the different circumstances of different countries. As I mentioned, this has always happened a lot in collaboration with local partners, right? It's also intrinsic to MI to do that and put a lot of emphasis on engagement with the communities and with the partners and national governments on the spot. But it is a very important work stream for us, and we are very much looking forward to continuing this work as well in other countries. I said before that we have done now collaboration in Kenya, Germany, Austria, and some other countries. We will continue doing that in many more. So looking forward to the continued collaboration, looking forward to this session. And with that, I hand over to Matteo. Thank you for joining and leading this session.
Thank you, Till, for a kind introduction and everyone for joining. I think that many of us were also in the previous session with Peter and Jacqueline, which I think was a formidable presentation about the experience in and the study that was done for Germany, which was indeed one of the studies where we used the Millennium Institute modeling. And in this presentation, we'll look at two other case studies and discuss more a little bit broadly the type of modeling that we do and the importance of this quantitative analysis to support our work. I'll be presenting this together with Fernando, which will take it over from here with a little bit of an introduction to the Millennium Institute to start with. Fernando?
Can you guys hear me now? It seems that when I share my screen, my microphone often goes mute. So yeah, I was just saying thank you everyone for joining and thank you for the opportunity to present in here. I want to give a brief introduction about the Millennium Institute. We have 4 decades of experience. We are a nonprofit helping governments and international organizations model long-term development strategies across climate, energy, pollution, the Sustainable Development Goals, and much more. We have, apologies. We have worked with over 40 countries across the globe, both in the global south and the global north. And the goal is always the same, supporting evidence-based national planning and helping policymakers make better decisions. Behind what we do at the Millennium Institute, we use systems thinking and system dynamics as the core methodology behind our modeling work. And the reason is pretty much simple. You know, today's sustainability challenges are deeply interconnected. You see climate, inequality, and economic development do not operate separately. They continuously influence one another. And however, policymaker is often still approaching individual sectors, which can sometimes limit the visibility across sector impacts and maybe lead to less effective long-term solutions. And systems thinking maybe help us move beyond this reductionist approach by understanding how the policies interact across sectors over time. And basically through system dynamics modeling, we can identify these synergies, review long-term impacts, and explore leverage points that may not be visible through the linear analysis that are commonly used. And building on the systems thinking approach, the ISD model is the main simulation platform that we use at the Millennium Institute. And this platform, this model, use different parts of the systems to see how things evolve over time. The model integrates social, environmental, and economic dimensions into a single framework. It has 24 modular sectors. It basically, depending on the project that we have, we can remove some sectors or add another ones to, depending on the analysis that we want to do. It has over 40,000 variables, allowing for very complex development and assessment of development pathways and long-term policy impacts. And it is especially useful and valuable because it gives us the ability to move this beyond these isolated indicators and move to something more, look into the bigger picture. So we can understand how changes in one area, such as like the energy inequality or investments in one area, can influence outcomes across the whole system. So one change in transport or materials, for example, will affect the whole model. You'll see the simulation being affected throughout the model. And with the ISD model, the policymakers and other users can test different policies pathways before implementing them in the real world. The model allows us to compare policy scenarios, test the sustainable development goals pathways, also assess climate development trade-offs, evaluate long-term investment impacts, and support national planning strategies. Okay. And basically at the Millennium Institute, we strive to turn data into actionable insights. We try to combine systems thinking, simulation, and long-term scenario analysis to help identify these leverage points and support more informed policy decisions. And that's all from my side, Mathilde. I think that's you, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Fernando. Actually, I can pick it up from the previous slide.
Perfect.
As you mentioned, the ISD model that we develop and use for this type of analysis is a system dynamics model. Some of you are familiar with system dynamics. A lot of the modeling in the sustainability field, it's done with system dynamics modeling. And actually, the very first global scenarios, sustainability scenarios back in the early 70s were already done with system dynamics modeling. Why do we use system dynamics modeling? Well, first of all, it's a methodology that allows us to draw system maps and simulate them. It allows us to capture the interaction between different elements in a system in a visual way to start with. And this is very important as part of our exercises when we need to involve stakeholders of various nature. It allows us to create a shared understanding of the system and of the model that we're going to simulate. Now, Fernando mentioned this is a model with 4,000 variables. It might seem large. Well, nowadays, when you think about large language models that have billions of parameters, a model made of 4,000 variables sounds actually quite manageable. And if it's portrayed visually through system maps, that helps a lot for everyone to have a shared understanding of how we generate the results that we then analyze and use to support alternative narratives. This is extremely important because one of the big problems nowadays with a lot of the sustainable development narratives is that the elements within those narratives are not properly connected quantitatively speaking. I think, Fernando, you also mentioned earlier on evidence-based simulation. we are now in a phase of sustainable development planning where there is not an absolute lack of evidence of how sustainable development policies are actually not at odds with well-being, but on the contrary, they mutually support themselves. But this evidence is often scattered. There is some parts of knowledge about how renewable energy might be implemented and how it might benefit the system. There is some other piece of evidence about how inequality might interact with climate issues and so forth. What we're trying to do with our modeling is really to bring all these elements together. So not to create individual pieces or knowledge component from scratch, but rather use the best knowledge available and integrate it in a coherent way. And these interactions are often nonlinear. The response that different factors might have as we introduce a policy to the system might be stronger in some cases, weaker in other cases, might change over time. And that is another reason why we use system dynamics modeling. It's a modeling language that allows us to represent and trace this nonlinearity in the system in a comfortable way. And finally, our modeling is really designed towards introducing policy changes or external scenario changes, and from there, develop alternative scenarios and assess their differences over time. This is not predictive modeling. When we generate a scenario, it's not as is to say, this is what is going to happen for Germany or for Austria or for Kenya. Rather, these are scenarios that are to be compared and are useful to understand the implication of policy changes that are introduced in a model on the results for different indicators. Fernando, you might want to jump next slide. Yeah, specifically with Earth4All, as Till mentioned earlier, we've been collaborating already in a number of countries and will do so in more countries. This is an extremely fascinating type of application for the ISD model because it's not simply a national application as we do with our traditional clients, which are typically within the Ministry of Finance or Finance and Planning in different countries, but involves a much broader range of stakeholders on much more extensive scenario analysis, in the sense that we look at much more deeper structural changes than we would normally do. And as part of this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the application in Austria and Kenya, while Peter and Jacqueline have already talked about Germany earlier on. What is really the core essence of these exercises with Earth4All is that while in the original Earth4All work, the fundamental 5 turnarounds and the giant leap to little too late scenarios were developed at the global level, which is fundamental because a lot of the development and sustainability issues that we face today are global issues. But in the end, the agency to actually act on these problems is at the national level. Hence, the importance to decline these scenarios at the national level. What do these scenarios really mean for countries as different as Kenya and Austria? And this is what we're going to talk about over the next few slides. Now, Austria and Kenya, well, we all know the countries, and we know they are fundamentally different in many ways. Right? From an economic standpoint, Austria is a high-income country. It has a per capita income that is about 10 times that of Kenya. It's fundamentally, we could say now, a low-growth economy or almost a no-growth economy, because over the last couple of years, GDP growth in Austria was on average close to zero, even negative. It also has a relatively stable population versus Kenya, who has a rapidly growing population, which will probably double over the next 35 years or so. It has a rapidly growing economy that will double over the next 15 years or so. But it starts from a very different situation. It has a very low per capita income and also has a much lower impact on the use of natural resources than Austria does, both at the per capita level and per GDP unit. Yet we'll see that the giant leap scenario makes a lot of sense in both countries, although this is, declined in a different way. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Fernando. So let's start with Austria. Austria, as I say, it's a high-income country. Nevertheless, as you can see from the bottom right graph in this series of graphs that you see here, there is still a relatively high percent of population at risk of poverty. And here, as also Peter and Jacqueline mentioned for Germany, the definition of poverty, it's broader than just economic poverty. It means ability actually to access the fundamental needs of the population. Right? It also has relatively, I wouldn't say high, but mid-high Gini coefficient, and exactly the graph at the bottom to the left. And you see that in the red line, which is a too little, too late scenarios, this Gini coefficient even tend to increase over time, over the next few years. So in each of these graphs, you see two lines, right? The green line, which is our giant leap scenario, and the red line, which is the too little, too late scenarios. And the time horizon for this graph is 2050. But we don't really need to focus on the precise numbers here, which you can find in the Austria report. It's important to consider the trajectories, right? So what our giant leap scenario meant fundamentally is a big change in use of land. And that doesn't mean change in the actual use, say, from agriculture to forestry. No, it means fundamentally a change in practice, in the agricultural practices that are adopted. Now, although agriculture only accounts for about 1% of Austria GDP nowadays, it, of course, uses a large percent of the country's land and is a very important component of the total emissions. Now, joined with better land management, we assume the larger spending on social benefits to reduce inequality, which you see at the bottom of this graph. And we also implemented policies that were directed towards increasing efficiency and therefore reducing energy consumption per capita and increasing the share of renewables in the country. Right? Now, this combination of policy does not imply a reduction in economic growth for Austria, which is also basically already nil. Right? Yet, it brought about a substantial reduction in the risk of poverty. So not only it allows us to progress very substantially towards the 5 turnarounds and to an increase in well-being, broadly speaking, but it also reduced poverty and made the country more resilient to external shocks. So this is how a global narrative of the giant leap scenario has been translated at the national level for Austria. Let's look at the very different case for Kenya. Now, Kenya, as we said, it starts from a much lower level of per capita GDP. Right? It's about 10 times smaller than Austria. And as such, it's an economy that is growing, and we cannot reasonably foresee that it would stop growing in the short term if the country has to address its socioeconomic needs. Yet, this growth doesn't have to be resource intensive as in other countries, and it doesn't have to be indefinite. Right? The first item of analysis that we focused on for Kenya was, what is the real bottleneck for the country in addressing its fundamental social problems, such as poverty and access to basic services. And thing is, the government was not able, and still not able, to release a sufficient amount of resources to care for the most vulnerable and provide the necessary services to the population. And one of the reasons this is the case is that it's heavily indebted towards higher income countries. And this is one of the key elements of the giant leap scenario. That is debt cancellation. At the top left of this series of graphs, you see the debt to GDP ratio for the country. And as you can see from the green line, in the giant leap scenario, we assume a substantial reduction in debt. And that is not a once-off intervention. Once we substantially reduce this debt to GDP ratio, then the debt payment are also reduced. The interest rate that the country pays is also reduced. And that brings to a stabilization in debt. At the same time, this frees a substantial amount of resources for the government, which is the second graph just below. So in the giant leap scenario, we see a huge acceleration in the amount of resources that are spent by the government, which also favor an organic economic growth based on better human resources. Now, what happens in terms of resources? Well, in terms of resources, as the economy accelerates, we also see an increase in CO2 emissions. And this is, of course, problematic. We say that the country is emitting far fewer amounts of CO2 emissions, both per capita and per unit of GDP, than higher income countries. Right? Yet this is not an entirely favorable development. However, it enables the country to accelerate its well-being and reach a point of a reasonable well-being, still with a level of emissions that is well below that of high-income countries. Poverty is substantially reduced. And the bottom right graph shows the level of access to basic services, which is also fundamentally increased. Right? So in Austria and Kenya, we have two fundamentally different stories. One of say an economy and a country that is in a relatively stable demographic situation, stable economic situation with high income but high level of emissions, versus a country that is very dynamically growing, both demographically and economically. Yet the same narrative, the giant leap scenario, decline in different ways, make a lot of sense for both realities. Now, as Fernando already mentioned earlier on, and we try to highlight in this quick presentation, today's sustainability challenges are deeply interconnected. While we simulated these scenarios for Austria and Kenya, of course, we didn't look at those 6 indicators only. We look at hundreds of indicators. And all these issues are tightly interconnected. It is not simple to identify pathways that follow the giant leap narrative, right? But it is possible. And running the numbers, which is fundamentally what we do, running the numbers behind these narratives shows that a pathway exists. Actually, multiple pathways exist. These scenarios that we created for Austria and Kenya are not meant, of course, to be the only possible pathway, but just example of the direction in which the country can go. Now, system thinking and this type of modeling allow us to explore these different pathways in a way that it's evidence-based. It allows us to look at the long-term implications. It looks at equity and equitability, and also it captures a lot, not all of course, but a lot of the complexity that we have to deal with. And that's how better futures emerge, is when we understand the system as a whole, experiment with it, learn about it, and gradually have a clearer view of our pathway. Yeah, with this, I think we can close the presentation, but we're very happy to hear from you, any questions you might have, and discuss any aspects of this.
Thank you very much, Matteo and Fernando. Great overview, also pointing out the differences in the different countries. I think we can stop sharing, Fernando, so we see the screen. I'm sure there are questions. There was one question by Ruth, which is now, I think she might have left. One question was about the well-being quantification. So maybe we can say a few more words about that. We often speak about increasing well-being within planetary boundaries, but what actually is well-being, particularly in a world where well-being is probably also interpreted very differently at different places. So maybe some words about this dimension of well-being. And the second question comes from Morten from Denmark. Does the model estimate how the public budget is affected by the policies in the different scenarios? So let's start with that, and everyone else, feel free to drop questions in the chat or raise your hand. And over to the two of you, Matteo.
Sure, Fernando, should I take this first?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Matteo.
Feel free to add as needed. I think the well-being question has two sides of it. The first is that, of course, in every country, based on the well-being concept that is developed in the Earth4All method, we use and identify a number of indicators that are suitable to represent well-being in a specific country. Right? But the other side of it is how we represent it in the model. And in the model, we do not marry any specific definition of well-being, which is normally developed in different well-being frameworks as the combination of a series of alternative indicators. What we try to do is to cover as many of those indicators as possible, right? And let the stakeholders define what is a well-being concept that it's relevant for them. At that point, starting from the root indicators, then we combine them into aggregate indicators or indexes as it makes sense for that specific group. Now, and yes, of course, the model does estimate how the public budget is affected by the policies. It's actually the very starting point of most of the policies that are implemented are changes in the public budget, right? This is what we define as budgetary policies. That is, we change the amount of expenditure, say, for a certain line, or increase the amount of revenue from another government budget line. And the implications are captured both in the deficit and are accumulated in the public debt over time. This is one of the fundamental constraints that, of course, we face in many countries. That is, are the resources for these big transitions available? How will they affect the present generation and the future generation who might bear more of the cost of these transitions? So it's a fundamental element that we always assess. And it's also one element that it's paramount to bring up front with in any conversation with the government.
Yeah, It did also play a big role in the German analysis. Peter referred to it in the previous session, right? Like also the fiscal rules, what element do they play in Germany, particularly the case of the debt brake. So it is a very, very important element. Here are two questions. One, Stuart in the chat. Thank you so much. Really powerful. As you do this, is the ability to model a country accelerating? For example, I think the National Strategy Project being set up in the UK could be really interested in a UK model. Stuart, you also feel free to flesh this out if you want to say a few words. Always great to hear the voices of the people directly. Yeah.
I think you got that. Thank you, Till. I think you got that brilliant presentation. I was, oh, I want to see the UK version of this because I can see the storytelling just getting so much more deep. I mean, the book has been such a powerful thing here, but hungry for more.
Yeah. Maybe I start quickly on that, Stuart, that we try to expand our Earth4All modeling to as many countries as possible. The restricting factor there are resources. It has a cost to it, obviously, because we don't only want to do some modeling that also then rests on the bookshelves of people, but want to make sure that it reaches the right people. So there need to be coordination efforts, resources, people available, as we have set up networks in all those countries we are engaged in. But the UK is certainly one that we would like to engage in as well. We have a lot of members there. We have like Kate Raworth, Tim Jackson, Lorenzo Fioramonti, who's speaking in the session tonight. So a lot of people are on the ground, and it would be a great community to do that. And if so, of course, with Millennium, not sure if you have worked in the UK before, Matteo.
No, we haven't. And as you said, it would be fantastic. Again, the constraint is not the technical aspects of this. As you might imagine, maybe in some countries we have data difficulties. It's not the case of the UK. But yes, fundamentally resources, especially to establish the whole process and make the exercise meaningful, as Till mentioned.
Very good. There's one question, and Jakub, great work. And she mentions it's not immediately maybe relevant to the system dynamic modeling work you're doing, but a question many of us might have seen popping up on social media in the last days as well, saying that if you could explain how come the RCP 8.5 scenario so suddenly, according to new data, became not relevant and not likely. That is referring to the debate of an extreme scenario being embedded and seen as not that likely currently, which I see currently particularly as ammunition or narrative being used by climate change denying groups to say, like, look, we told you all along that this is not such a big deal. And there are, of course, many factors playing into that, right? There's the prevention paradox, of course, that if you try to do something and then the worst case scenario becomes less likely, then all of a sudden, if you take it away, people say, see, it wasn't the reason all along. We saw that during COVID a lot. But maybe, Matteo, Fernando, if you want to, not sure if you want to say something specifically on that, but if not, maybe also the broader question, I guess, is the certainty of scenarios, right? I think one thing we see since 50 years, since the limits to growth in 72 was always seen as prediction, right? It was always said, oh, the limits to growth predicts that the oil runs out in 1990 and the apocalypse is in 1993. That was never the case, of course. It was always about scenarios, and scenarios include assumptions and a certain amount of uncertainties. And I think, in my perception, the misunderstanding between scenarios and predictions is a big difficulty. And maybe we can broaden that question to that, Matteo, and curious to hear your thoughts as well.
Yes, thank you, Till. I think you're pointing exactly to the direction I was also thinking about. That big misunderstanding that we're carrying over the last 50 plus years has to do also with our ability to understand the results of simulation, right? When we generate scenarios, say for an Earth4All application, right? We don't generate two scenarios. We analyze many of those, hundreds probably every exercise, and then just select those that are most interesting and representative of the actual narratives that we are discussing, right? And we do so because it is complex, as Till mentioned. to not to present, but to understand results for probability distribution, for instance. It is clear that when we're looking at the future, we're looking at uncertainty as an expanding cone of possible trajectories for every single indicator in the model. So the big question is how to best convey this to the broader public. And it's often the case that when we choose the simplest way, that is an individual trajectory, like, people might think that is a prediction, or this is actually the only possible pathway. On the other hand, the opposite solution, which is to display the whole range of possible trajectories and the probability distribution, it's overwhelming to many people. So there lies the difficulty. And concerning the climate scenarios, what we do in ISD model is that we take climate scenario as exogenous assumption to the national development. So in the model, we can rapidly select alternative future developments for the world climate, and we see the repercussion, the implication at the national level. We won't argue which exactly which SSP is going to take place, but we allow users to see the implications of different ones. And of course, as the global set of scenarios are updated and become more reliable over time, we do so and we reflect this in our modeling.
Super, thank you, Jakub. Does that make sense? You want to comment? You want to say anything else? Feel free to come in.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the broader scape, I think, kind of makes sense, because this specific case, as you said, it's kind of very picky, I would say. But in a broader sense, it brings like the general, I think, a bit weak point of, in general, like relying on predictions and I guess systems in general. Is just that, like, it's very easy, I would say, for the public to kind of dismiss certain scenarios, or like say it doesn't work because of that, right? And yeah, so thanks for that.
No, thank you. And I think one aspect I appreciate about this work as well is the transparency about uncertainties in a way, right? It is never pretended to have the objective future outlook now. Like, I don't know at how many places in the Earth4All book we mentioned that this is uncertain. We can't predict the future. We don't know. We have different scenarios. All of that. While I feel like it's more actually often mainstream neoclassical economists which pretend to objectify certain outcomes of calculations and modeling, rather than admitting the kind of uncertainties in that, and that connects, and maybe Matteo, you can refer to both, and to another question in the chat, which is a question of how modeling can help with rebuilding work, for example, Syria or Ukraine. It is an interesting thought, because actually, Stuart, there have been conversations some time ago already with Ukrainian representatives about these ideas. We couldn't realize it so far, also due to the funding issue, but there was an interest of seeing, like, hey, rebuilding, of course, also needs to integrate the social and environmental and economic factors integrated in a way, right? And we would like to build scenario work based on that. And I remember we spoke, Matteo, and I think you have done some work in war-shaken regions as well, where the uncertainty is even higher than in, let's say, Germany or Kenya, I assume, right? But what is your thought on that?
Yes, it is, but it's also a wonderful occasion when we have to fundamentally rebuild the infrastructure and the industries in a country, and the overall setting and scheme for the public services. It's an occasion to rebuild it in a different way, right? As we think of situation like a country like Kenya that we just presented, where they can, of course, go through an economic development process by leapfrogging a lot of the stages that we had to go through in our countries. The same is true for countries like Ukraine and Syria, where the human capital there, it's certainly very high. And we do not need to reconstruct following the old traditional model, but rather think already ahead. And again, leapfrog a lot of the steps, redesign the system, already thinking about a sustainable and I would say dynamically resilient system. Right? It's from a technical perspective, of course, this type of modeling, it's well suited to those situations because it represents the physical stocks of infrastructure, of productive capital, and so forth. And therefore allow us actually to simulate, if you want, the impact of a destructive phenomenon like a war, and then simulate the reconstruction of those infrastructure with different parameterization that reflect different characteristics.
Great. Thank you, Matteo. We have 3 minutes left of the session. If there are any burning questions, please feel free to ask them now. And otherwise, I will briefly refer to the next session of the marketplace before maybe Matteo and Fernando can say some final words. I would recommend you to look at the agenda. We have some more interesting sessions today. At 2 p.m. there will be an Earth4All materials workshop because Peter Hennecke mentioned in the previous presentation that we included the material and resource consumption stronger in some national engagements, for example, Germany, than we did in the overall global book. But there is another initiative from the Club of Rome that deals with this topic. And we have 4 speakers, Sandrine, Lars Morten from the EEA, Luisa Kenji Hoddercool Institute, and Walter Steil. So I recommended to join that at 2 p.m. We have a session at 3 p.m. on storytelling and art for change. We have a session at 4:30 p.m. on roadmap to eradicate poverty. That's referring to the recent efforts by the UN Special Rapporteur on eradicating poverty beyond growth, a report that will be launched very soon. And there's a lot of engagement around that currently, where Earth4All is engaged in as well. And I also highly recommend the final session tonight at 6 p.m., which is then really translating all of the things we have heard in the last 2 days. How does this Earth4All and well-being economic policy work in practice? What happens if we want to translate it into policy? And that will be a debate between Lorenzo Fioramonti, professor and former minister in Italy, and Amanda Yanu, currently running as governor in the US, moderated by Michael Mezzatesta, 6 p.m. CET. Highly recommend you to join that as well. Thank you very, very much. Maybe some, Fernando, Matteo, if there are any final words you want to share with the audience, feel free to come in. Fernando.
Sure. I just want to take a moment to say that, can you guys hear me?
Yes, very well.
Oh, perfect. I just want to say that the ISD model has dozens of different applications, and if you're interested to learn more on how the ISD model is applying, now you probably stop him. If you want to see the model and how it can be applied to different projects, you can go to the Millennium Institute website and schedule a demo with us. We have a 30 minutes and go through the model, explain a little bit more deep how it works. So go to millenniuminstitute.org and learn a little bit more, and maybe schedule a demo session with one of our policy analysts.
Yep. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all for participating, and please be in touch.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matteo, for a great presentation. Next year at the marketplace, we will have 5 more reports, I hope, from different countries, maybe amongst them the UK. Thank you for doing all of that. Looking forward to the collaboration, and see you in the other sessions. Thank you all.